Sometimes trust blinds us, especially when it comes from a bond we deem unbreakable. Everything seems safe until the moment a crack silently appears, corroding the relationship without us noticing. And by the time we realize it, we are already too deep in to come out unscathed. This is a story about trust, about a mistake that began with a handshake and ended in something much deeper and irreversible. Good evening, Dom. I've always followed the stories you tell, and I thought a lot before writing mine. But I think the time has come to share it. I never imagined that doing business with my compadre would end up being one of the worst mistakes I ever made, something that would come to destroy the friendship we had built. My name is Omar, and today I want to share an experience I had some time ago. I always believed that compadres were like family in our village. Everyone said that even without blood ties, the godfather bond was sacred. We shared joys, difficulties, and responsibilities. We counted on one another in good times and bad, because it wasn't just a friend, but a chosen brother. That idea was always reinforced by my father's example and the compadres he had. That's why, when it was time to baptize my son Arthur, I didn't hesitate to call Edson to be the godfather. Back then, I saw him as part of my life, someone I fully trusted and always welcomed into my home. I never had any reason to doubt him. Our friendship spanned years, filled with shared moments and mutual help in difficult situations. It seemed only natural that he would take on an important role in my son's life. Edson accepted the invitation with a smile, displaying his usual confidence. It never crossed my mind that time would drive us so far apart that we would lose respect for each other and that everything we'd built would unravel. I spent my entire life in the mountains, working on the ranch that belonged to my father and later became my responsibility. It was a property built with sweat and dedication. We didn't have wealth, but we were never without the essentials. My wife and I adapted well to life in the countryside. The cold dawns, the scorching midday sun, the smell of cattle, and the crickets chirping at nightfall. We lived with what we needed, and with the peace of knowing all of it was ours. Edson, on the other hand, led a different life. He lived in the city almost 60 kilometers away. From a young age, he was involved in trade, always seeking new buying and selling opportunities. He was restless, wanting more than he already had. He said that in the city, opportunities were bigger, that money circulated in a way you wouldn't see in the countryside, and that there, no one worked just to survive, but to grow quickly and stand out. Whenever we met, he would comment, "The ranch was nice, but it didn't yield much profit. I worked too hard for what I earned. There were easier ways to make money, and all I needed was to open myself up to them." He didn't say this out of malice, but because he genuinely believed it. However, I never considered any other business beyond the land. With what we had, my wife and I lived a decent life. Everything began to change when Edson suggested that I open a taqueria, a small restaurant specializing in tacos, something very popular in the city where he lived. He said that in the city, there was room for such a business, with quality meat, good service, and a unique touch. He assured me that he and his wife would take care of everything: management, customer service, hiring employees if necessary. My part would be supplying the meat and investing an initial amount. With the ranch and my contacts, I would ensure both quality and a good price. He assured me that the risk was minimal, that it would be guaranteed profit, and that the business would thrive no matter what. In the beginning, I wavered. I had never ventured into something like that. I understood nothing about finance or commerce. My life was different. But Edson insisted, repeating that I should trust him, that I needn't worry about anything. He would handle the complicated part, and I would just keep doing what I'd always done, securing the supplies. It took me months to decide, not because I distrusted Edson, but because the idea of stepping into an unfamiliar world didn't seem right to me. However, his words kept pounding in my head. He said that in the city people spent money without thinking, and that if we did everything the right way, we would soon be making a good profit. He spoke with such conviction that in the end, I ended up convinced. One day, after much hesitation, I accepted. I didn't know I was taking one of the most misguided steps of my life. In the first few months, the business went steadily. We didn't have significant earnings, but we also didn't accumulate losses. The taqueria was gradually finding its place. Edson and his wife, Daniela, ran everything in the city while I took care of supplying the meat. Every week I delivered the best I could, sometimes buying from acquaintances at a good price, other times slaughtering a cow from my own ranch. Everything was done with care, believing that quality was the path to the business's success. In addition, I invested heavily. I bought tables, chairs, and put a large part of my capital into the structure. Over time, business picked up. At first, it was just neighbors curious about something new, but after 3 months, the taqueria was already known. People said it had the best meat in the region, that the seasoning had something special, that the tacos were bigger. Edson said his wife played a part in that. Daniela came from a family that believed in charms, amulets, and energies. According to him, she did everything possible to strengthen the business. She used protective charms, performed rituals, and kept the environment clean to prevent sales from dropping. She always said it was better to be safe than sorry. Some time ago, my comadre gave us a few red fabric pictures, saying they would protect us from envy and ill intentions. I didn't understand these things, but I also saw no reason to refuse. If it was with good intentions, it wouldn't hurt. One afternoon, while I was delivering fresh meat, Edson explained that the first few months would just be an investment period. At the beginning, it would barely cover costs, so we needed patience. The important thing, according to him, was that the business was gaining traction and that finances would improve over time. I knew nothing about commerce, so I trusted his experience. The taqueria remained busy. In the streets, I saw occupied tables, satisfied customers, and employees rushing about. But I never asked too many questions. If Edson said there was still no profit, that meant there really wasn't. There was no reason to doubt him, not yet. By the 5th month, my wife started getting uneasy. We still owed money to ranchers and neighbors, people from whom we'd recently bought cattle. At first, she didn't say much about it, but I noticed that every time we talked about the business, her expression changed. I insisted that everything was going well, that the taqueria was growing, that everyone spoke highly of the place. But she didn't seem convinced. One night while we were having dinner, my wife gave me a serious look and said that something was giving her a bad feeling. She didn't speak angrily or accusingly, but with genuine concern. She cautiously suggested that maybe Edson wasn't being entirely honest. For months she had heard about the taqueria's success, the growing crowd, but we had never seen a single cent of the money we were supposedly making. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I asked, feeling a tight knot in my stomach. That same week, I decided to go to the city to talk to Edson. I didn't want to go there making demands, but I also couldn't keep living with that uncertainty. When I arrived, the taqueria was packed, as usual. The employees were moving all around, the rotating spit of pasta meat, a preparation method similar to kebab, spun non-stop, and the tables were filled with lively customers, chatting and laughing. Everything seemed fine, but in my mind, my wife's voice kept echoing relentlessly. Edson greeted me with the same confident smile as always. However, when I mentioned what was bothering me, his expression changed. He didn't show surprise or nervousness. He just became serious, visibly uncomfortable. "I would never deceive you, let alone keep something that doesn't belong to me," he said firmly. "We've known each other for years. We're compadres, almost brothers. It saddens me that you think this of me." I was left speechless. I didn't want to argue, but I also couldn't ignore my doubts. Edson said he understood my unease and didn't want distrust to arise between us. Then he took out a bundle of bills. It wasn't a fortune, but it also wasn't a small amount, and handed it to me, saying it was part of the first profits, that he'd already intended to pay me that week. He assured me he wasn't taking advantage of anything, that his top priority was keeping my trust. I looked at the money in his hand, and my mind was flooded with conflicting thoughts. I recalled my wife's words, the months I hadn't received a thing, the taqueria always being full, the meat I delivered without fail, the accounts I never checked. But at the same time, I remembered the years of friendship, the shared moments, the significance that being a compadre held for me. I took a deep breath and returned half the money. The business belonged to both of us. I knew I had outstanding bills with the ranchers who sold me cattle in recent weeks. I knew I had already invested almost everything I had. The cost had been higher than I'd anticipated, but I continued to trust my compadre, just as my father had always trusted the people around him. 6 months had passed since the taqueria opened. The routine went on unchanged. Every week I would go down to the city, buy groceries for the house, and drop off the meat at the restaurant. My mistake was trusting too much and not paying attention to what Edson was doing. He showed me pages filled with numbers, accounts I didn't know how to interpret. Math was never my strong suit, and I simply accepted what he told me. Until one afternoon, after loading up my purchases as usual, I stopped by the store where I always shopped. The owner had known me for years. We would always exchange a few words about what was new in the city, rising prices, trivial things. But that day the conversation took an unexpected turn. The shopkeeper looked at me curiously and asked about the taqueria. He said that with the restaurant's level of business, I must certainly be earning a lot. I assumed it was just casual conversation and replied honestly. I explained that the profit was coming in gradually and that we were still trying to recoup our investment. But his reaction caught me off guard. He frowned, gave a slight smile and said, "There's no need to be modest. Edson praises the business every chance he gets. They say that when he goes out drinking, he buys rounds for everyone without even worrying about the bill. I've also heard that he hands out free tacos to his friends like money isn't an issue." His words floored me. The story I knew was different, but something there wasn't adding up. I tried not to dwell on it, but the unease was already growing in my chest. I explained that Edson had always told me profits were still low, that returns hadn't come in yet. The shopkeeper, who had been in sales for years and knew more about business than I did, shook his head and swore he'd bet on it, that taqueria had been turning a profit since the first month. I fell silent. For the first time, I felt deep in my gut that something was off. The weight of suspicion settled in my chest, a tight knot in my throat every time someone mentioned Edson's success. That day on my way back to the ranch, I tried to stay calm. But along the dirt road, I could only think of my compadre's face, the man I trusted, to whom I gave my effort, my savings, my labor. And now, it seemed he was lining his pockets with what I had built through sweat and sacrifice. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, fists clenched in anger. I thought of my son, my wife, how much we'd sacrificed to try and grow. I remembered all those dawns I woke up before sunrise, every penny I saved. The next day I returned to the city. On the way I tried to convince myself to keep calm, to act prudently. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was letting rumors cloud my judgment. But every time I recalled people's expressions and comments about the taqueria, the knot in my chest tightened even more. When I arrived at Edson's house, he welcomed me the same way as always, calm, carefree, as if nothing had changed. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, his audacity or the fact that he acted like everything was perfectly normal. We sat at the table. I didn't want to beat around the bush. With a tense but steady voice, I got straight to the point. "People are saying things about the taqueria, about the money you spend, the invitations you make, the tacos you give out as if they cost nothing." I took a deep breath, keeping my gaze firm. "I also want to talk about the debt you still owe me, the money I took from my savings to start this, which hasn't yet found its way back to my hands." Edson remained silent as I spoke. He didn't interrupt me, but with each word his face grew more tense. I expected him to defend himself, to say it was all just gossip, to assure me there was an explanation. But he did none of that. He only looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at that moment, but later understood as discomfort. When I finished, he stood up abruptly. "It's not fair for you to come to my home and accuse me as if I were a thief," he burst out, trying to contain his anger. "You know very well what you're insinuating." His reaction caught me off guard. It wasn't a firm denial, not the indignation of someone wrongly accused. It was an attack, a desperate defense from someone who felt cornered. In that moment, everything clicked for me. If he hadn't done anything wrong, he would have shown the records, explained the figures, tried to clear up the misunderstanding. But instead, he lashed out, cast himself as the victim, and acted as though all the credit was his, as if my labor and my money hadn't mattered for the taqueria's existence. His words hurt me more than I imagined. Throughout all those months, I never doubted my role in the business. I knew that without my meat and my investment, the taqueria wouldn't even have gotten off the ground. But hearing Edson talk like that, as if my effort was worthless, was like taking a knife to the gut. I ground my teeth. Anger burned inside me, and I couldn't hold back any longer. "You're a scoundrel, an opportunist who never knew what real work was," I shot back, my voice filled with rage. "You've always looked for the easiest way to make money." I saw in his face that my words had hit home. Edson was always proud, unable to bear being seen as inferior. And now, standing before me, he was exposed for what he truly was. Without warning, he lunged at me. The first blow came before I could react, and then anger took over. In an instant, we were on the ground, fighting like two enemies consumed by pent-up hatred. His wife's screams echoed through the house, drawing the neighbors' attention. Soon, several people rushed in to pull us apart. Hands grabbed me by the arms while others held Edson back. My chest rose and fell quickly, my body burning with rage. But even then, surrounded by stunned onlookers, I didn't stay silent. I looked at Edson with all the contempt I felt and shouted for everyone to hear. "The taqueria exists thanks to my efforts. You stole my money to set it up. You're a cheat who took advantage of my trust." A heavy silence followed. The neighbors looked at us with a mix of shock and discomfort. But what struck me most wasn't their reaction. It was Edson's expression. His face was still filled with anger, but behind it lay something else: shame. And now everyone knew. In small towns, gossip travels fast, and I knew this one wouldn't take long to spread. After that clash with Edson, things were never the same again, not for me nor for him. Even though my routine at the ranch remained unchanged, the outrage still pulsed inside me. But at least I no longer had to pretend nothing had happened. The story spread quickly around town, and soon everyone was talking about it. What Edson did didn't remain hidden. Taking advantage of my trust had consequences. His taqueria began to feel the impact. Business dropped. Customers started avoiding the place. He still had money, but the days of a full house were long gone. The town branded him a cheat, and that reputation doesn't go away easily. He could keep running the business, sure, but without the respect he once had. As for me, I preferred to keep him away. I didn't want more arguments or to drag out the conflict. But there was one detail I couldn't ignore: the money he owed me. Sooner or later, I'd have to demand it. However, I didn't want to be responsible for another scandal. I decided to wait. When the right time came, I would confront Edson again, this time to settle everything once and for all. Before that moment arrived, another concern began to consume my mind. Something in my own home was different, and this time it had nothing to do with my former compadre. At first, it was a small detail. My 11-year-old son complained of a discomfort in his foot. My wife examined it and found a dark spot on the sole, as if he had stepped on something that left a mark. It didn't seem alarming. We figured it would go away with time, like any minor injury. But it didn't go away. A few days later, the spot began to grow. First, a slight darkening around it, as if the skin was fading. Then it became rough and dry. He said it felt uncomfortable to walk on, but nothing unbearable. My wife tried some home remedies, and we believed it would go away soon. A week went by, and it got worse. The spot spread, covered almost the entire sole of his foot, and started reaching his toes. The skin became swollen, purplish, with a tight look. The way he walked changed. A slight limp he tried to hide, but the pain was obvious. That was when the worry became real. Something was wrong. We took our son to the doctor, who immediately ordered tests. The doctor asked questions, tried to find explanations, but everything was progressing too quickly. The only option was to admit him and monitor how things developed. His foot was deteriorating. Coming home without him was devastating. My wife stayed by his side, but I felt powerless, as though we were losing control of the situation. And then, the worst happened. 2 days later, I realized that our dog was also sick. At first, it was a subtle detail. He kept licking his snout as if something was bothering him. I thought maybe he'd hurt himself on a bone or found something strange in the field. But looking closer, I saw a small dark spot on the base of his snout, right where the teeth started. The memory of my son's foot hit me hard like an unexpected blow. Without hesitation, I took the dog to the city's veterinarian. He prescribed ointments and medications, advising me to watch the wound's progression for a few days, but time brought no improvement. The lesion in the dog's mouth spread quickly. The skin around his snout turned from an inflamed red to a dark, almost black shade. His tongue also began showing signs of decay, as if it was gradually deteriorating. His suffering was evident. He whimpered whenever he tried to eat or drink, and that sound tore me up inside. Every night I carefully applied the medications, but nothing seemed to work. He would cower, hiding his snout between his paws as if he already knew the pain would never end. I felt completely powerless. All I could do was hold him after each treatment, trying to convince him, and myself, that everything would be fine. But deep down, the doubt grew. His last night alive was the most painful. He was restless, mostly unmoving, but he let out small, low, anguished whimpers, as if silently fighting something we couldn't see. I stayed by his side, running my hand along his back, feeling his labored breathing under my fingers. I stayed there, in the dark, listening to his last cries. Slowly, his sounds faded. When day broke, he got up just once. I called his name, tried to touch him, but he didn't respond. His snout was completely black, and part of his eyes showed the same dark patch, as if something invisible had devoured him overnight. I knelt by his side and stroked his back one last time. The cold body under my hands confirmed what I didn't want to accept. "Come on, my friend, give me a sign." But he could no longer hear me, and I cried. Ever since he was a puppy, he'd been part of the family. He grew up running through the fields, resting under the trees on hot days, accompanying me in the cold early mornings while I tended the cattle. Now he was gone, with nothing I could do, and I stood there motionless, trying to absorb the void he left behind. I knew I had to bury him, but my hands trembled at the thought. I took a deep breath, trying to ease the lump in my throat, but there was no relief. And then a thought hit me like a punch in the gut. What would I tell my son when he came back and couldn't find his companion of all those hours? This couldn't be a coincidence. First my son, now my dog. Something was terribly wrong. Ever since that night, sleeping had become a torment. The weight of anguish followed me wherever I went. I would close my eyes in the hope of a moment's peace, only to find nightmares. The first was the worst of all. I was in the clinic. The room was small and cold. My son lay in bed, covered by a white sheet that barely reached his chest. His skin had lost its glow, turning a pale, purplish hue. His diseased foot looked worse than ever. It wasn't just the swelling or the darkened flesh. The shadow had risen, reaching his knee. Something was wrong there. Very wrong. I wanted to move, but I was paralyzed. I could only watch. Then he began to cry. Tears rolled down his face. His hands trembled. His mouth opened in a plea for help, but no words came out. And I couldn't do anything. That was when my eyes caught something impossible. A shadow took shape in the room. It had no defined contours, no face or any human feature. It moved like a thick fog, but with the predatory intent of a living being. It didn't walk or float. It slithered, sinuous, until it threw itself over my son. The scream that echoed was piercing, slicing through my chest like a blade, a sound that instinctively made me want to cover my ears. He thrashed, tried to break free, but that viscous darkness engulfed him completely, sucking him inside itself, suffocating him with an impossible weight to resist. Then, right before my eyes, his skin began to give way, rotting in real time. His cry changed. It was no longer his, no longer human. The lament that came from his mouth was the same one I'd heard before, on that last night with my dying dog. A sound that stuck in my mind, echoing endlessly in my head, filling every corner of my being with an indescribable dread. I woke up with a start, my body bathed in cold sweat, my lungs desperately gasping for air, my throat dry as though I'd been screaming non-stop. I was alone. My son was still in the hospital. Almost every day I went to see him at the clinic. I only returned to the ranch when necessary, to sell milk and secure money for his medicine. That afternoon I visited him, hoping to find some improvement. But the exhausted look on my wife's face sitting by his bed immediately told me things hadn't changed. "He's stable," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion, "but the spot hasn't stopped." Now it wasn't just his foot. The progression was slow but steady, moving up his leg. The doctors talked about transferring him to the city, where there would be better resources to treat him. That was already worrying enough, but what my wife showed me next turned my unease into genuine terror. With trembling hands, she held out her palm to me. There, at the base of her fingers, a dark spot was forming. Small, no bigger than a coin, but identical to the one that first appeared on our son's body. She clenched her own fingers, as if wanting to tear that mark away, and her voice broke into stifled sobs. It's been tingling for days, and now it's started to grow, she admitted, through sobs. I pray every night, I beg God to protect us, for all this to end. But I just don't know anymore, I don't know. Despair seeped into her every word. Something was corrupting our family, rotting us from the inside out. My wife said that a few days earlier, she had spoken with an elderly woman who had been hospitalized for a long time, someone ill with a lung condition. She told her what was happening with our son, and without hesitation, the woman offered one piece of advice: look for a healer. She held my hand tightly, seeking a certainty in me that I didn't have. I don't want to doubt anymore, I just want to save our son. And then in the midst of that suffering, she confessed something else: her dreams. Nightmares that kept repeating, always the same, accompanied by the feeling that something terrible was about to happen to me. Right there, I decided that I wouldn't go back to the ranch that night. I couldn't leave them alone, not after everything. The ranch without them was just an empty space, a shell without a soul. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there alone, afraid that by morning, reality would bring even worse news. I spent the night in one of the hospital chairs. Sleep never came. My wife couldn't rest either. From time to time, she got up to check if our son was still breathing, if he hadn't worsened. The silence of the early hours weighed on us like a warning. Something was watching us and waiting. The next morning, the hours dragged on. When afternoon came, I said goodbye to them and set out for the ranch to make sure everything was as it should be. The route was long and tiring, but this time, fate placed me in front of someone with an unexpected message. Shortly before taking the dirt road that led to the property, I spotted a familiar face by the roadside, waiting for a ride. I recognized him right away, a man from a neighboring community who occasionally passed through. He had always been polite to me, so without hesitation I slowed down and invited him into the truck. After a few minutes on the road, we started talking. I told him about my son's illness, my wife's despair, and how the doctors still had no concrete answers. He listened attentively, then, without beating around the bush, suggested I find a healer. He explained that in certain situations, medicine wasn't enough, that there were invisible forces that corroded people little by little. He paused, as if considering what he was about to say. He seemed hesitant, maybe afraid of planting bad ideas in my head, but finally he spoke firmly, saying he knew what had happened with my compadre. Sometimes those who appear good harbor envy inside them. That's more dangerous than any poison. Hatred can do terrible things. My mind went straight to my comadre's family. They had always taken these matters of magic seriously, whether called white or black. I didn't know how to respond. The mere suggestion that someone could be attacking us on purpose made my insides churn. I tried to push the idea away. Edson couldn't be that kind of man. He couldn't betray our friendship, much less wish harm on my family, and he would never do anything against his own godson. When I arrived at the ranch, the sun was already setting. But something seemed off. The house, though the same, didn't give me the same feeling as before. I got out of the vehicle and walked in slowly, feeling an unexplainable anguish in my chest. That was when I remembered the small fabric pictures my comadre had given us years ago, objects that, according to her, served as protection. I went up to the bedroom and started rummaging through the dresser where my wife kept her things. I figured they'd be in the jewelry box, and when I opened it, I found them. There were two, still carefully folded among necklaces and bracelets. But something about them had changed. The fabric pictures, once red, were now dark and stained. Time couldn't have caused that. The material seemed contaminated, corroded by something invisible. A blackish color permeated the weave, as diseased as my son's foot, as diseased as my wife's hand, as diseased as the snout of the dog who was no longer with us. The terror I felt at that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I had never been a man of easy beliefs. I always remained skeptical of such stories, but in that moment, I could no longer ignore it. My wife had already suggested it. The man who hitched a ride reinforced the idea, and I had nothing left to lose. Our son was still in the clinic. Each moment of waiting was torture. If there was even the slightest chance, I'd take it. So on the day the doctors assured us that the boy's condition was stable, we decided to go. We went to the healer's house. It was on the outskirts of the city, a simple adobe dwelling surrounded by trees. There we were greeted by a man of the countryside like me. 50 or so, skin marked by the sun, a calm gaze. His smile was serene when he opened the door and invited us inside. Without hurry, he led us to a small room. And there, for the first time, I felt I was about to understand what was surrounding us. He asked us to sit and began with a few questions. Not many, just the essentials, like someone testing the waters before moving forward. As we spoke, his expression grew more serious. Then he took a wooden box, opened it delicately and revealed its contents. A collection of small colored boards, each decorated with mysterious symbols. He set them on the table and asked us to arrange them in the way we thought was most appropriate, considering our son and recent events. In silence, he watched the result carefully and patiently began interpreting the drawings and colors. As he analyzed each detail, his expression grew increasingly tense, until finally he said with concern, "The burden you're carrying goes beyond what it seems. This is not just an illness. There's something deeper, something involving hidden forces. It's a curse, the work of black magic. And behind it is a couple, a middle-aged man and a woman, both very close to you but who harbor resentment toward your family." Hate overtook me in that same instant. I didn't need more explanations. I already knew exactly who he meant. Edson and his wife. An uncontrollable fury seized me. For a moment I tried to push aside that certainty, but there were no more doubts. How could they do that to their own godson? A child who looked up to them so fondly with no guilt in any dispute. What happened next left a permanent mark. My compadre grabbed my arm firmly, trying to hold me back, but I was far from calm by then. The healer said he could help, but he needed to see my son immediately. We didn't hesitate. We went straight to the clinic. When we arrived, he went over to the bed, placed his hand on the boy's forehead, and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for several minutes, motionless, immersed in such deep silence that I could hear even my wife's quickening breath. Time seemed to stand still. A dark energy hovered over my son, and the healer knew he had to act fast. It was thanks to him and to the doctor that things began to change. It wasn't immediate, nor a sudden miracle, but little by little, that oppressive shadow began to fade. Each of the healer's visits brought a bit more relief. He worked calmly with no false promises, but with the certainty that his knowledge was having an effect. The doctors concluded that my son no longer needed to be taken to the city. His skin, once marked by decay, began to recover. Although the wounds were still visible, the infection showed signs of receding. He stayed in the clinic for a few more days under observation, until finally we got the news we'd been waiting for. We could take him home. When I held him in my arms after so long, seeing him still in that bed, it was as if a ton had been lifted from my chest. I hugged him with all the strength I could muster, feeling his frail body but warm, alive, holding that essence I was so afraid of losing. We returned to the ranch with all the recommended care. His foot needed protection and the treatment had to be followed strictly. But above all, he was there with us. That house, which for days had seemed cold and filled with fear, became a home again. But there was still something left to resolve. I made a request of the healer, something that to me was worth more than anything else. I didn't want protection or extra blessings. I wanted justice. I asked that all the suffering that had been inflicted on my family fall upon those responsible, that they feel the same pain, the same decay, the same despair they had imposed on us. And I was willing to pay any price for it to happen. It didn't take long for the taqueria to close. At first, people thought it was temporary, that the owners were dealing with health problems, but no one knew exactly what was happening. Gradually, rumors spread through the town. They said Edson had suddenly fallen ill, that his body was weakened, and that his wife wasn't well either. One day, someone told me they saw my comadre rushing down the street, her face hidden under a shawl. It wasn't like before, when she walked with firmness and confidence. Now she avoided people's eyes, as if burdened by shame or fear. That was enough for me to know they got what they deserved. They tried to destroy us, driven by greed, envy, and resentment. But what they planned against us ended up turning against them. And that still wasn't the end. Almost a month later, they found Edson's body under a bridge. He was dead, almost unrecognizable. The entire city felt the shock of the news. For me, there was no surprise. At that moment, I realized something inside me was finally settling down. The hatred, which had grown like a suffocating shadow, began to lose its grip. It was a weight I had carried since the moment I understood what that man had done. I couldn't stand the thought of him continuing to live, guilt-free, without paying for his actions. Every time I looked at my son and saw the marks left on him, I felt the fire of fury consume me. Every time I passed by the place where I buried my dog, disgust overcame me. Edson took everything from me: my peace, my trust, the safety of my home. He tried to destroy us without any hesitation. I couldn't share the same world with him. I couldn't breathe the same air as a man so filthy, so wretched, so corrupted inside and out. And I don't regret anything. I never will. I don't expect to be understood. A man does what he must for his children, to protect them, to ensure they have a decent future. And I will never allow anyone to hurt the ones I love again. Time passed faster than I could have imagined. Sometimes, looking back, I can hardly believe everything we faced, every obstacle we had to overcome to get here. But now, seeing my son smile, standing tall and strong, his life on track, I know it was all worth it. He finished his studies, got a good job in the city, got married last year to an amazing woman, and soon he'll be a father. My grandchild is on the way. When he told me the news, a lump formed in my throat. It wasn't sadness, but an intense happiness, a joy that filled me in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. I couldn't help remembering those dark days, when each dawn was uncertain, when I saw his skin withering before my eyes and there was nothing I could do. But I held on. I fought. I wouldn't let someone as despicable as Edson take away what I now hold proudly. I protected what was mine, as a man should, with firm hands and a resolute heart. Sometimes I wonder if my soul will have a place in heaven after everything I've done. Maybe not. Maybe I won't find rest when my time comes. But as long as my eyes are open, as long as I can watch my family grow, as long as I can hold my grandson in my arms when he's born, I know there will be no regret. I'll live out what's left of my days with no remorse, because in the end, I did what had to be done. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. The Mexico City subway was welcomed as a landmark of modernity, a symbol of the metropolis's relentless growth. However, not everyone viewed this progress with optimistic eyes. I, Claudio, spent years digging those tunnels, and from the start, something about them made me uneasy. What we experienced in the 70s only reinforced my fears. The rumors began as mere chatter among workers. Some mentioned a low, menacing sound in the more isolated stretches, a noise unlike the usual rats that infested the underground. Others swore they had seen two glowing yellow points fixed in the darkness, as if someone or something was watching them from afar. Few spoke openly about it, but the unease began to spread. With over 20 years working underground, I had seen it all. Accidents, cave-ins, colleagues who were never found. But this was different. The air felt heavy, the silence almost tangible. The sensation of being watched grew day by day. It was on one of those late-night shifts with 5 other co-workers that we heard something impossible to ignore. A deep, resonant growl that traveled through the tunnel in unsettling echoes. We froze, exchanging looks filled with uncertainty. "Did you hear that?" whispered Renan, the youngest in the group. I nodded, keeping my composure. "It's probably some animal stuck down here," I replied, trying to calm everyone, but deep down I knew it wasn't. That wasn't the sound of a cat, a dog, or any other animal I had ever heard. Work went on, but the atmosphere was tense. The sound of tools hitting the rock seemed too loud, as if each blow triggered an invisible alarm. That was when Vinicius let out a muffled scream, dropping his flashlight. "There, I saw it," he stammered, pointing into the darkness. We turned our lights in that direction, but there was nothing. He was trembling, pale, struggling for words. It was tall like a man, but it wasn't human. Its eyes were glowing in the dark. We ended the shift early. No one wanted to talk about what happened, but we all knew something strange was lurking in that darkness. Rumors multiplied. Workers asked to switch lines, fearful of what might be running through the tunnel. Reports of homeless people and drunks disappearing in the subway passages became more frequent. Some swore they had seen the figure moving too quickly among the shadows, and the most disturbing detail, the descriptions were always the same. Tall, skeletal, pale skin, sharp teeth, yellow eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. Some said it was a creature that fed on blood. One night I was tasked with inspecting a temporarily closed tunnel. I wasn't alone, but the idea of crossing that dark space made me uneasy. As we moved forward, one of the flashlights began to flicker, plunging parts of our path into total darkness. That's when I saw it. About 30 meters away, two yellow eyes shone in the dim light. At first I thought it was just a reflection of some metal surface, but then those eyes moved. The figure slowly emerged from the shadows, revealing a slender, disproportionate body with arms and legs elongated in an unnatural way. A terror beyond words took hold of me. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't run away either. It just stood there staring at me. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "Run!" I shouted, and without waiting for anyone's reaction, I turned and dashed toward the exit. The others followed me, but no one had the courage to speak about what happened that night. I tried to erase that scene from my mind, but it was useless. The image of those eyes fixed on me haunted my thoughts and my dreams. The stories spread and reached the ears of the subway administration, which at first mocked the accounts, dismissing them as mere superstitions. But as more people began to vanish and reports of strange noises increased, something changed. They decided to act, but without making a fuss, to avoid panic. One night, a group of armed men, accompanied by important figures from the administration, showed up in the tunnel where sightings were most frequent. They asked some of us to join them, but they didn't say exactly what they were looking for. The operation proceeded in silence until the first gunshots echoed through the tunnels, followed by muffled screams. No one ever explained what happened inside. I just remember seeing several men dragging a huge shape covered by tarps into a truck. Some said the creature was unconscious. Others insisted it was still fighting back, letting out furious growls as it tried to break free. The tunnel reopened days later as if nothing had happened. New workers were assigned to the area, and over time the stories began to fade. But not all of them. Some workers insisted that even though the creature was taken away, something of it still remained there. They talked about shadows that moved on their own, air that felt denser, a disturbing sense that someone or something was still nearby. I felt it myself. One night, after taking a few days off, I was scheduled for a shift in the same tunnel. The moment I entered, a familiar tightness gripped my chest. The cold, damp concrete felt suffocating. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work, but every sound echoed in a disquieting way. As we inspected one of the sections, a noise made us freeze. Something was lightly tapping against the walls, a muffled, persistent sound. "Did it have a family?" One of my colleagues ventured, trying to force a laugh. But his voice gave away his nervousness. We proceeded slowly, flashlights aimed at the end of the corridor. The sound was coming from a metal door leading to a tool storage room. We knew that space was empty. We opened the door, nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched remained. That was when I heard it, a deep, resonant growl, so much like the one I had heard on that fateful night. My blood ran cold. My co-workers heard it too, and the terror on their faces said it all. "Let's get out of here," I whispered before my voice failed me completely. We left the tunnel without daring to look back. The moment we surfaced, we felt immediate relief. No one said anything for the rest of the night, but we didn't need to. We knew it had been real. Weeks later, an older worker who had been there since the first subway excavations told me something unsettling. According to him, this kind of thing had happened before. In the early years of construction, there were similar accounts. Shadows moving in the depths, inexplicable sounds echoing through the subterranean corridors. Some believed the tunnels had awakened something that had been there for a long time. "The rats started disappearing when we reached the deepest layers," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "And what we saw, it's not normal, Claudio. Something is living down there. and I doubt this was the last time we'll see it. I tried not to dwell on his words, but they haunted me for a long time. Little by little, many of my co-workers quit, unable to bear the constant fear. Those who stayed did so only out of necessity, but no one returned to those tunnels without a chill running down their spine. Years later, already out of the subway system, I ran into one of the workers who had been with me that night. We chatted for a while, and between sips of beer, he revealed something I didn't expect to hear. "That thing wasn't alone," he muttered, lowering his voice. "That subway creature." That night I saw other shadows, but I said nothing. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. His words chilled me to the core. If there was more than one of those things, where were they now? We never heard anything like it again, but that didn't mean they weren't just waiting. Other stories also came to mind. Guards, operators, conductors, many had similar tales. People who sensed strange presences in the tunnels, who saw things moving where there shouldn't be anything. Once, while we rested after a long shift, a guard known as Dodo decided to open up to me. He was a hardened man of few words, but that night he seemed to need to share his experience. It happened at one of the newer stations on the line. I was alone, as always, checking for trespassers. The silence was heavy, only my footsteps echoed. Then I heard a scream, but not just any scream. It was high-pitched, desperate. I had to stop for a second just to breathe. That thing wasn't human. It sounded like pain and rage mixed together. Thinking it might be some homeless person trapped, I went there with my flashlight. But as I moved closer, a deep instinct told me to stop. I've never felt fear in my life, but there, something inside me warned me to turn back. I didn't continue. I ran to the station entrance and stayed in the guard booth until morning. After that day, I never patrolled that section alone again. When I had no choice, I stayed as far away as possible. Someone else who shared a story with me was Vicente, an experienced conductor. He spoke quietly, as though he feared being overheard and fired. It was a test run close to midnight. The car was empty, at least that's what I thought. While driving, I noticed something odd. The lights began to flicker. I thought it was an electrical issue, so I went to the back of the car. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. There, between the seats, I saw a shadow moving, tall, thin, almost gliding. But when I checked at the end of the line, there was no one. It vanished. Vicente lowered his voice even more. After that day, every time I passed that stretch with passengers, I prayed. One of the most unsettling accounts came from a police officer known as Lopez. His job was to patrol the subway entrances and exits at night, ensuring no one broke into restricted areas. One night, while inspecting a grating near a station entrance, a strange sound made his blood run cold. It was a screech, but not an ordinary one, he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. It sounded like something scratching the metal from the inside. Acting on instinct, he approached, trying to see through the darkness. That's when he saw it. Two yellow eyes, motionless, watching me. Fear gripped him so hard he couldn't react. His body froze, as though held captive by the creature's gaze. He stood there, unable to move, until the eyes vanished into the darkness. After that night, Lopez never went near that grate again. Whenever he could, he warned newcomers never to patrol that area alone. These stories only confirmed what I already knew. The tunnels harbored secrets the authorities tried to ignore. But the stories did not fade. Among workers, conductors, and guards, reports continued to circulate, spreading like whispers among those who worked in the depths of the subway. And every time I heard a new account, I wondered, had that creature, or perhaps creatures, really left for good? Or were they just waiting for the right time to return? Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. This happened a few months ago. I've been working as a driver for Lyft, a rideshare service similar to Uber, for quite some time, mostly during the late-night shifts. The traffic is lighter, and the tips are usually better, but there's a price to pay. Sometimes something happens that sticks in your memory and not in a good way. I've always been a cautious person. I've had my share of weird passengers, but nothing, absolutely nothing, ever came close to what I experienced that night. At the time, my car didn't have a dash cam. After this incident, I made sure to install one. Everything started as usual, just me alone listening to the occasional hum of my old 2005 Volvo's engine. It had seen better days, but it never let me down. The streets were completely deserted, which, as I mentioned, was the kind of scenario I preferred. A little after 2 a.m., I got a request to pick someone up from a nearby convenience store. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but something gave me an odd chill down my spine. You know that feeling when you sense something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on why. That was exactly how I felt while driving there, even before I saw the passenger. I quickly understood why I felt so uneasy. The store was closed with no lights on and no cars in the parking lot. As I got closer, I saw the man. I slowed down to get a better look. He was pacing back and forth in front of the entrance, wearing a filthy hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. I'm not exaggerating, there was a hole in the sleeve. His movements were erratic, jittery, as if he physically couldn't stand still. Every few moments he glanced over his shoulder like someone who thought they were being followed. If I had to guess, I'd say he was under the influence of something. The smartest thing to do would have been to cancel the ride and get out of there. My finger even hovered over the cancel button, but I hesitated. Instead, I unlocked the doors. He got in without saying a word. I regretted it the instant I let go of the brake. Most people spend their ride staring at their phone or looking out the window. Not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror, without blinking, without looking away, fixated on me. I did my best to ignore him, but inevitably our eyes met a few times. There was something in his expression that made me uncomfortable. He looked irritated. To break the silence, I turned on the radio, picking a random station. The moment the music started playing, he ordered me to turn it off. His voice was rough, coated in cigarette smoke, and low enough to catch me off guard. For a brief moment, my hands faltered on the wheel. I resisted the urge to look at him and just obeyed, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. No other words were spoken for a while. I hoped it would stay that way until the end of the ride. But then he spoke. I remember his words exactly. He asked me if I had ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. The question hit me like a punch. I let out an awkward laugh before answering. Well, I hope not. I tried to keep things light, but he didn't react. He just leaned back in his seat and mumbled something I couldn't make out. Then he started talking about how he used to be an Uber driver, but quit after a group of kids stole some things from his car. His speech was slightly slurred, making it hard to understand everything, but I got the gist of it. As he talked, I glanced at the rearview mirror a few times and noticed that he was smiling the whole time. That deeply unsettled me. No one smiles like that while telling a story like this. He finished with, "Funny how you trust someone sitting right behind you so much." At that moment, I stopped seeing him as just a strange guy and started seeing him as a real threat. My heart pounded, but I didn't have many options. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing fear. I fixed my eyes on the GPS, clinging to the destination as if it were my only way out of this. But he wouldn't shut up. He kept talking non-stop, mixing nonsense sentences, some disturbing, others just incoherent. I couldn't keep up with any of it. At one point, he started apologizing. The scariest part was that I was almost certain those words weren't directed at me. "I didn't mean to do it." Pause. "Sorry." The repetition of those phrases made me even more nervous. I had no idea what he had done, and I didn't want to find out. I stayed silent, afraid that any response could trigger something worse. We were only a few minutes from the destination when he suddenly snapped out of his mumbling and yelled at me, claiming I had missed the turn. That wasn't true. The GPS clearly showed we were on the right path. Still, I hit the brakes, more out of fear than anything else, and he demanded that I pull over. My hands were shaking as I obeyed. I just wanted this to be over. The moment I put the car in park, a pair of headlights appeared behind us. A police car. I held my breath as I watched the patrol car approach, its lights casting a brief glow inside my vehicle. The guy in the back seat ducked down, trying to hide. I turned my head quickly and saw him curled up, eyes shut, practically lying on the seat. I looked away just as fast, trying to control my breathing and act like nothing unusual was happening. He stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to tell him to get out, but fear kept me paralyzed. Finally, he lifted his head and told me I was lucky. Before I could react, he opened the door and vanished into the darkness. After that, I ended my shift early. I was too shaken to keep driving. It took me weeks to realize just how much danger I had been in. I saw a news article on my phone about a robbery at a convenience store that same night, just 2 blocks from where I had picked up that passenger. My stomach twisted at the thought that I had been inches away from someone capable of terrible things. If he had decided to hurt me, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I don't know if sharing my story would help in any way, and for personal reasons, I prefer not to get involved with the police. But since that night, I've become much more selective about who I let into my car. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.